So, welcome everybody to our thematic workshop on human rights and due diligence. I thank Sarah and Jacque in advance for participating and giving us an introduction insight into this topic. We're just, so you're informed, we're going to record this session, but just the parts that Sarah and Jacque are going to deliver to us, and to the questions part, we'll not publish that and will not record it. And if throughout the session you have any questions, you can either just write them down for yourself or also share them in the chat, and then I'll collect them in the end, so whatever you prefer. To give you all an oversight, our goals for this workshop are to provide an introduction to human rights and due diligence and what that really means for SMEs in Switzerland. Will then also provide us with insights into practical examples through his company Manroof. And then we'll also do an exercise where you'll participate and brainstorm. And then in the end, we have time to answer any open questions or doubts that you might have. I'll just start off by giving you, for those of you who aren't already part of the Swiss Triple Impact Program, I'll give you a quick overview. So the Swiss Triple Impact Program is a program that we launched, that B-Lab Switzerland launched in September. The goal of the program is to mobilize the Swiss economy and especially the SMEs active therein in reaching the Agenda 2030 and participating in and addressing the SDGs in a very wide variety. Our goal is to activate more than 3,000 companies in 3 years. Our program is unique in the sense that we'll, in the end or each year, we'll provide and put together a national directory and benchmark of Swiss SMEs that are contributing and taking action in regards to the SDGs and the Agenda 2030. We are active on a national level, so we're planning to launch 10 regional platforms, whereof we've already launched 7, and we provide these platforms in 4 different languages, so German, Italian, French, and English, so that everybody can participate in their preferred language. And our basis of this program is a complementary function. So we work together with already existing partners and players in this ecosystem and harnessing synergies in order to really achieve this goal and get some traction and activation very quickly. Just as a quick overview, the program is established in 3 different sections. So the first is that you get an overview to the SDGs in general, that you're familiarized with the tool that we use throughout the program, which Sarah and myself also later on will then also take reference to, is the SDG Action Manager, where you fill out questions, a questionnaire, and regarding the SDGs, and you see how your company measures to it and where you already contribute and where you could contribute more, and you can set goals, work interactively with it throughout the program. In the next step, when a company then decides to participate in the Swiss Triple Impact Program, we provide 2 workshops. The goal is to first off identify which SDGs a company will focus on and take into their core. We recommend that it's only about 4 to 5 SDGs, not to be too broad and not really have a main focus. And then in the next step, we define what measures should be taken and how to define these measures. What is a good measure? And throughout the whole program, we use the SDG Action Manager, and this thematic workshop is within the Swiss Triple Impact Program is one part in the second step, whereby participants have access to experts such as Sarah and gain insight from Jacque from Manroof. And then, as I mentioned before, we are establishing the SDI directory for a national referencing and to see where you're at. So I think at this, everybody got a good overview of what the Swiss Triple Impact Program is. And if you have any other questions or want to know more, please then in the end ask questions or feel free to reach out anytime. So I'll hand over to Sarah for the first part of this workshop. and the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jessica. Hello to everybody. Well, if we were in a normal room, in normal circumstances, we probably would have done a sort of a tour de table so that everyone can just introduce itself. We'll have to skip that and just imagine ourselves around the table. So my name is Sarah Dekkiche. I'm working as an advisor on responsible business conduct and human rights. For also here in this context for the Positive project, a Lausanne-based B Corp certified consultancy specialized in responsible business conduct, and the founder, Sarah, another Sarah, is also here on the call, so we're happy also to answer questions there. Prior to that, I used to work a couple of years at Amfori BSCI in Brussels, which also Jacque knows about, and 2050. So I'm very happy that we can have this session and indeed also talk, and probably there will be some questions at the end about that, about how indeed to address sustainability and responsible business conduct, both horizontally but also vertically in a company. And actually when we talk about business and human rights, we especially look at really deep into the supply chain. So the objective of today's session and what we propose you to go through in the next 1.5 hours, and here I guess we can go to the next slides, is we'll start with a general overview. So when we talk about business and human rights, what are we talking about? So I guess that here the challenge today is that some of you might be new to the topic, others less. I already know that some participants are even experts on this. So we'll still give a general overview on that. We'll look at then specifically what it means to assess risks and impacts, and we'll have an exercise on that that will just ask you to think about it briefly before then we go to Manroof's specific case. And I'm very happy that Jacque von Mandach accepted to present his approach and how he is addressing these issues today. We'll then have indeed sufficient time for discussion, for Q&As in the end, so feel free to ask that. I don't know, Jessica, should questions be addressed via the chat function, or can we just can they be asked orally? So should people also start to write up questions as they come to mind, or should we keep everything for the end?
No, I think if people are comfortable with asking them in the end out in the open, then perfect. And otherwise you can also feel free to use the chat. So whatever people are more comfortable with.
Okay, all right. And I realize that actually the first 2 blocks here will address them together. Okay, so then we can go to the next slide. So, okay, well, so why actually are we talking about human rights? What are human rights in business a topic? Well, I think the term and this concept of human rights in business is less new, I think, these days, especially as we went through a long campaign here in Switzerland under the Responsible Business Initiative. So I guess that is also allowed to bring the topic, the concept, a bit more to public awareness. But still, what is meant exactly and how is it transposed in practice? I think this is still an open question, or at least still a challenge that companies are facing. So we'll start to address that a little bit today. So when we talk about, or why are we talking about human rights in business, and how does this come from? And here we can go to the next slide. Is if we go back a little bit more into the origins of this concept, we have to here come to Professor John Ruggie and go back to the early 2000, so 2005, when the UN Commission on Human Rights adopted a resolution requesting actually the Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, to appoint a special representative on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises. And here I like to use an example. You might remember Rana Plaza. Of course, it happened after 2005, but it's an example that I guess most of you would know, and that illustrates well how we come, or also the purpose of this mission and the sort of the mandate that Professor John Ruggie was appointed to do. If you remember Rana Plaza, this factory in Bangladesh that collapsed in 2013, making I don't remember, over 1,000 deaths, thousands of injured people, so really a big disaster. And this kind of things happened. It's not the only example, but it's one of the most mediatized example, and really an example that I guess people really kept in mind, and where one also realized actually that when something happens also further down the supply chain, even very far away in production facilities, that actually it has an impact on the whole business. And the difficulty in this kind of cases, in this kind of happenings, is that in the end, one can question who is in the end responsible for that. Where does the responsibility lie for when something like that happens? Is the responsibility with the owner of the factory who doesn't implement the right health, security, and working conditions? Is it the responsibility of the state that doesn't enforce the law sufficiently and doesn't control sufficiently what entities in their jurisdictions are doing? Or is it the responsibility of the brand that is sourcing from this factory? And actually, back to come back to this study that the UN appointed Professor John Ruggie to do, was based on the observation that in fact there was a gap in responsibilities. So one couldn't define who in the end is responsible. So this is why Professor John Ruggie's mission was to identify and clarify the standards of corporate responsibility and accountability in transnational operations, in transnational corporations, and also to elaborate on the role of the state, etc. And what he came up with is the now known protect, respect, and remedy framework, and where he lies down that, of course, the state has a duty to protect human rights, and the state plays this role more or less well, of course, but this is a clear duty that is also a bit more known. But next to the state duty to protect human rights in the jurisdiction, also companies have a responsibility to respect human rights. And where abuses might happen, where a disaster happens, where something happens, there needs to be a greater access for victims to remedy, whether through judicial or non-judicial means. So this framework was clearly established at the time. And based on this work, he was then further asked, so that his mission was renewed, and he was asked to further fine-tune the different, to elaborate further on these different pillars. I'm not going to go here in details, and here we can go to the next slide. And this is how we came about in 2011 to the guiding principles on business and human rights, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, here also unanimously adopted at the UN level. So for the first time, therefore, the international community, in the majority, at unanimity, acknowledges and recognizes here again that companies have a responsibility to respect human rights, and recognize the framework that was established to define or to define this responsibility. And what the UN guiding principles clearly say is that in order to respect human rights, companies should avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts through their own activities, but also seek to prevent or to mitigate adverse impacts that are directly linked to their own operations or those of their business relationships. And again, provide access to remedy where needed. It is also clearly stated that these requirements apply to all companies, so of course transnational corporations, but also smaller companies. So it's really a responsibility that applies to all companies, regardless of size, sector, or geography. And when we talk about human rights here, one takes into account all internationally recognized human rights, meaning those of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we just celebrated the 72nd anniversary last week, and also, of course, all the other frameworks that are linked to that, such as the ILO core conventions, etc. And what the guiding principles also say, and it's important to understand the guiding principles, and that's why I insist on that, because here in Switzerland, if you have followed the debates around the Swiss Responsible Business Initiative, in fact, the Responsible Business Initiative was a mirror of the UN guiding principles. So today, more and more frameworks do call upon these guiding principles. So it's really the foundation of everything when we talk about business and human rights. So what the guiding principles also say is that in order for companies to fulfill their responsibility to respect human rights, they should be undertaking ongoing human rights due diligence. And here we can go to the next slides. So this is a graphic that I've taken from the OECD, because the OECD has also further elaborated on this mechanism, this management process, of course, in respect to the way it was framed by the UN. So today, if you will, the guiding principles from the United Nations and also these guidelines that the OECD has developed really serve as the basis, as the reference. It's sort of the Bible when it comes to human rights due diligence. So what is clearly defined when we talk about human rights due diligence? Well, it's actually a risk-based approach. It's actually a risk management applied to human rights, meaning that the specificity here is that a company would assess and identify the risks it would, it can, so it may effectively or potentially cause to people, to humans, to rights holders. And that's an important difference to the approach that we classically know in risk management in companies, and even in risk management as we know it from a CSR approach. Where usually we are used to think in risks in terms of risks to the business. And if you have also done your own CSR strategies and looked at it, you would probably have looked at, okay, based on my internal stakeholders and my external stakeholders, where are the biggest material risks of my company? Here, really, when we are in a human rights logic, companies think in terms of impact on people, impact on rights holders, and that's an important specificity. So when we talk about human rights due diligence, what is actually required is sort of, again, this the full dimension of a risk assessment, where you first start by embedding these principles into your policies. So larger companies typically now have dedicated human rights policies, statements. But this also is reflected into code of conduct, etc. And I'm sure Jacque will be able to illustrate that concretely afterwards. So you basically, as a company, you embed these principles into your processes, into your management systems, into your policy, and you do actually, again, here the whole classical circle of a risk based approach, meaning that you need to identify where your risks on people are, where your human rights risks are, and you assess them, you evaluate them. So you look at the ones that are most severe, more salient, we say in the human rights jargon. And of course, in order to be able to identify where your business, again, might cause or be linked to or directly linked to adverse human rights risks, you need to have a full visibility of your supply chain. So basically you start by trying to get the most transparent view on your supply chain. Of course, the bigger you are, the more complex it is, in order to identify where your risks are and evaluate them. And then of course you need to implement the right mechanism in your company in order to be able to prevent harms to happen, or be able to seize or mitigate them, continuously tracking, communicating what you have identified, what you are doing and how you are improving, and of course provide remedy for remediation, always through meaningful stakeholder engagement, so always working also with civil society, governments, peers, etc., in order to engage in this process on an ongoing basis. So it's really a process, an ongoing process. So no one requires a company to get everything right from the start. I guess that everyone is also aware that as we operate or as we live in a globalized world where a lot of things are interconnected, where everything is very complex, some companies have very complex supply chains, risks may happen. So the idea is really to be able to identify, to have also a step-by-step approach, really starting where the risks are biggest, etc., etc. And the purpose is really to be able to know and show on a continuous basis. So this is sort of the theory around human rights due diligence. And then we can go to the next slide. Interesting is to see that since, especially since the adoption of the guiding principles, a number of both voluntary schemes and more mandatory schemes are emerging. So, well, in Switzerland, we are just out of the very heated and long debates again around the Responsible Business Initiative, and I have a slide on that a bit later. So we see really a trend going actually from soft law to more and more hard law. And this is actually a slide I've developed for the Geneva Center on Business and Human Rights for an event we did early October. But which is still very much up to date. And I don't want to go here into the details of all the boxes, but what I want to illustrate is that these principles of, again, respecting human rights throughout the value chain, of this responsibility that companies have, is accompanied by a series of frameworks which exist. Some existed already, but we see more and more coming up. So first of all, if you look at the yellow part, the national action plans come also from the fact that as part of the state duty to respect human rights and accompany businesses in their own responsibilities, it is also foreseen by the guiding principles that the state develops its own strategy as well and explains how it is going to honor the guiding principles and how it is going to support the actors in the country to do so. So today, more than 20 countries have implemented so-called national action plans, and actually Switzerland has implemented its own national action plan in 2016 with a renewed version in January this year. And this is also very important and interesting to see that in Switzerland, both voluntary support mechanism existed, and this went in parallel with the requests for regulation, so for a mandatory framework around it. But so since a couple of years, more and more countries are coming up with their own national action plan. But again, this has no regulatory dimension. It's really a voluntary scheme. And of course, pressure from civil society is becoming bigger and bigger, saying that, well, it's all good to have these voluntary schemes, but in fact, things are not moving fast enough. Some companies are very good at already undertaking human rights due diligence and embedding this in their own company, yet it is still too little and abuse continue to happen. So civil society is more and more putting pressure to ask for regulation to come and and frame this a bit better. Examples of regulation are the UK Modern Slavery Act. So UK has in 2015 come up with this regulation that focuses on modern slavery. It addresses mainly bigger companies and is mainly a reporting requirement. We have in France the Loi sur le devoir de vigilance. There are other modern slavery statements in other countries, etc., etc. So we see now a trend whereby more and more countries by themselves are coming up with their own way to regulate this. Switzerland now will put into force, in principle, the indirect counter proposal that has emerged as a consequence of the non-adoption of the Responsible Business Initiative, but it's also a form of regulation. And we see more and more countries actually coming up with regulation. And we see also that this request for regulation is more and more moving away from a reporting requirements to more and more mandatory human rights due diligence, a bit like what is the case in Switzerland, meaning that actually they take the guiding principles as a basis and they really want companies to be legally obliged to implement this responsibility. If I try to explain it in a simple way. Interesting also to see that today the European Commission is working on an EU level framework. We'll have to see whether it's going to be a directive or a regulation, but at EU level now also stakeholders are saying we need to have some harmonization there, and we want all actors to be taken accountable, to be held accountable for their responsibility, and that has to come from the European level. So Commissioner for Justice Didier Reynders committed to submit a legislative proposal in the first quarter of next year. So this responsibility to respect human rights is more and more supported by both voluntary frameworks and mandatory frameworks. And we can go to the next slide. So I mentioned the Swiss National Action Plan. If we want to come back to Switzerland, that also concerns us a little bit today. So I don't want to go here into too much detail, but I think it's important to understand that the Confederation has since 2016 a strategy in place whereby again it recognizes there's responsibility that they have as a state, or the duty they have as a state, but also the responsibility that companies have. And the National Action Plans includes a number of measures, including some where the Confederation say we put measures in place to help you companies to be able to understand these requirements and to be able to translate them in your operations, especially SMEs. So the government has a specific attention also for SMEs. Actually, in my previous function with 2050, we were mandated by the SECO and the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, the two entities that coordinate the National Action Plan, to provide a number of tools and sessions to help companies to understand these requirements. We did one with Best for Geneva, for example, etc. So there is a framework here that is dedicated to help companies to understand what is expected and how to transpose it. And we can go to the next slide. And here I just proposed a quick recap on the legislative side. As we are just a couple of days after the popular vote in Switzerland around the Swiss Responsible Business Initiative, so which was now, as you all know, rejected because the majority of the cantons was not there. So unless I think there would be a new referendum proposed, the counter proposal, the second indirect counter proposal, should come into force next year. And what it says, well, it addresses, it has two dimensions. One is a non-financial reporting requirement, and the other requirement is one of due diligence, but mainly for companies operating in the extractive sector, whereby they import minerals from conflict zones or high-risk geographies, and also companies for which there is a high suspicion of child labor, whatever high suspicion means, but this is how it is framed. So there is here also a request for companies falling into this scope, and SMEs are clearly excluded from this scope, to also to have the right policy in place and the right mechanism in place, and be able to report annually on the measures they have been implementing. I don't want to go too much into details here, but if you have some questions around that, I'm happy to take that for the end. What I just wanted to say is that it was interesting to put the responsible business initiative in parallel with whatever is going on at European level, because we see countries like Germany now working on a legislative proposal that is very close to what the responsible business initiative suggested or required. And as I mentioned before, the European Union is working on something that is also quite similar, that one could compare to what the Swiss Responsible Initiative requested. It is actually even going a little bit further, because here the civil liability would apply through the entire supply chain and not only controlled entities. A priori, because I guess there are heated debates now to see indeed what exact scope this directive or this regulation will include. But well, that was just a bit to show or to explain also the regulatory trend in which we are, and what in the end will be also required from companies in Switzerland as the counter proposal will come into force. So that was for the general framework. Next slide. All right, and here we wanted, before we go into more the practical side, and where we will have Jacque van Mandach, who is the CEO of Manroof, explaining how he is embedding this in his company, and especially how, as a company, again, when you have different suppliers, when you produce different kind of products, you can really effectively assess your risks and undertake this process on an ongoing basis. We wanted to challenge you a bit, or to have you discussing some questions we have prepared for you. So it's not really an exercise, it's actually more a brainstorm session where we would be curious to hear your views before we can share them, and have Jacque coming back to them as he does his presentation. So the questions we invite you to think about are, and for that we will try to break you in little groups, so you have time to exchange. I will try to come from one group to another, just to also understand from your views and from your own company's perspective, understand which human rights can or are affected by your company's activities, products and services, and those of your business relationships. So what is your understanding on that, and actually how do you assess that, how do you evaluate this today, and what management processes you have in place, or you could have in place, to prevent and address this. So we are curious to hear from you, and we'll give, I think, 5-10 minutes for you. 5 is maybe too short, let's say 10 or a little bit less, depending on how it goes, just for you to discuss this. And we are curious for some of you then to share that with us, if you agree, as we come together and we then go to Jacque's parts. But maybe before, are there any urgent questions that would prevent you from going into that? If not,
perfect. So
excellent.
I'll stop the sharing. If all of you have written down some notes that you know the questions, I'll put you assign you into breakout rooms. You'll get a pop-up on your screen, and then you can just accept, and then you'll be brought to the breakout room.
Excellent. All right. Yes, I think we are ready to. I hope it was not a hard stop. Okay, so I think everyone is back now. All right, so if we take, let's say 5 minutes to share a little bit, so there were 3 groups. Maybe if one person per group could give us a 1-minute summary of the main points of your discussion. And if there is no volunteer, I will nominate a volunteer. Okay, so then maybe I will ask someone from the second group where I was in. Apparently you had interesting discussions. So Anya or Julia?
Sure. Yes, thank you. So we got stuck with question 1, and we had a very interesting discussion about the work we do. So one is, we talked about public procurement. I don't actually work for a public company, but I consult a public company on the SDGs. And it's often, so when you, public procurement is definitely one topic where you can have an impact, because you have, often you have a high volume of things that you buy, and there you can have an impact on, you can often, ESG topics or human rights topic aren't so, it's not easy for people to think how it affects their public procurement. So I think there's a lot to do, especially also with relation to the SDGs, where that's also one focus now is on it, that you need to focus on it. So it affects a variety of human rights. Yeah, so that's one topic we talked about. And then we talked a bit about sustainable finance. I don't know, Anya, whether you want to add something on.
Yes, yeah, we just said that in a conclusion somehow how diverse sustainable finance is. For example, I am in a team working on engagement, so we have dialogues with companies that we are, or a pool of investors is invested in, and we address human rights topics, and we have regular phone calls with them. We make them aware of different topics where they are, for example, mentioned in a report. Now I think a lot of attention is given to the Uyghur forced labor issue in the Xinjiang region in China. So we have this dialogue with companies and point out certain things and expect them to make things better. As you said, Sarah, it's like an ongoing process where we want to see how they improve on the issues raised.
On mute. Okay, thank you. So, well, you deviated a little bit from the exercise, but that's fine. But I think you brought up interesting discussion points, and I suggest that we keep them for the discussions afterwards. Indeed, public procurement is an interesting point, and actually, in principle, states have to show the example also on human rights, and of course public procurement is an important aspect to that. I'm happy also to come back to the link to the SDGs. And Jessica is also here to discuss it. So I suggest that we keep that for later. But here really what I wanted you to think about is, if you put yourself in the shoes of a company, if you are not yourself representing a company, and you hear about, okay, human rights due diligence and all the things that are expected from a company, how actually do you do that? Where do you start? And how in practice do you assess your human rights risks? And it is a bit what I wanted to you to reflect on. So is there on that something from, or an outcome, or from another group? Maybe Stephanie from your group.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So what we briefly talked about was, if you're a company that is just starting out to engage in the issues of in the area of business and human rights, probably the first step that you would do is a human rights-based assessment, where you first of all get an overview of where are your production sites, where are your main markets, where are your main supplies come from, and then look at the business environments and the risk that they pose to the business. So then normally you would do that with a color coding, so red, medium, so red for high risk, medium for risk and green for low risk, and then take it from the base assessment, at the same time raising awareness for human rights issues in the company, because awareness normally is one of the most critical issues. And then afterwards, once you've done the base assessment, moving on to an action plan, how the gaps that you have identified or the high risk areas you can actually work on. Then there was a question in our group whether human rights violations or supposed complicity in human rights violation happens only in high risk countries, or if there are issues that have to be taken care of in Switzerland, Germany, France, and countries where we wouldn't expect it. And there is a point that, for example, the gender wage gap is a human rights violation that happens in Switzerland or in Germany or somewhere else, in companies that are headquartered in these human rights stable countries have areas such as gender, diversity, occupational health and safety, and employment practices that surely also need to be taken care of in countries that are normally not human rights high-risk countries. I hope that's a fair summary.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. And looking at the time, I will suggest that we stop the exercise or the discussion here, but please keep your points and reactions to that for afterwards. Here I would like now to link to Jacque van Mandach, who will be able now to give us a very practical insight into, well, at Manroof, actually, how does he address that? How does he implement that and reflect this back in the business? And also, I think, Jacque, you're also interested in making a link with the SDGs. So how do you articulate that in your business?
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you very much to be at this webinar. Can you hear me?
Yes,
good,
very
well. So my name is Jacque van Mandach. I'm an owner and CEO of Manroof in Zurich, Switzerland. And this company exists already 20 years. And we sell promotion products, mainly textile products, a lot of things, bags, textile products like towels, lanyards, but also drink bottles. We are eight persons at Manroof. The next slide, please. So we are a little company, and what is special here is that the CSR, the responsible person is the CEO. So I am responsible for the CSR, and we have been dealing with the CSR topic already for many years, because we have been member of Fair Wear Foundation since 2008, and our turnover is around 3 million euro, and our clients are mainly in Switzerland. The next slide, please. So this year we have sold a lot of flags for political campaigns, but also masks, which we didn't sell a year ago. So as a trading company, you have to be very flexible to keep your turnover, but we still sell a lot of bags, cotton bags, organic cotton, or polyester bags. And we buy mainly in China, about 60 to 7% is from China. And we produce the banners in Greece. So we have also some suppliers in Europe and a few in Switzerland. Next slide. So some basic information about sustainability. Of course, you probably know what is sustainability, but I like to repeat that sustainability is three things. There's a social aspect, an ecological aspect, and an economic aspect. And Manroof is very strong in social sustainability because of our membership with the Fair Wear Foundation. But also the ecological sustainability is important for us and for our clients. So it's always good to make this division. And there is a link to the SDGs For example, on the right side, you see the topic living wages, which we need to solve according to our membership with Fair Foundation. And if you solve it, you can then solve many SDGs. So at Manroof, we are member or certified with 4 standards. So we have a lot of know-how about the standards, because the standards have different levels. They have a different philosophy, and the key for sustainability for Manroof are the standards. So the problem is the working conditions, the not good working conditions, and the key is the standards, and the standards give us guidance to solve the problem. So for the textile production, we are a member of Fairware, and for a non-textile, we use the standard AMFODI BSCI. And then we are a GOTS certified. This means organic cotton. We can offer certified organic cotton, and we are also licensed by Fair Trade. Next slide. So we come to the first answer to the first question: how we identify the risks. So, as we are a member of Fairware, we use all the information, the websites we get, and the Fairware Foundation has a very good information about working conditions in the different countries. You can also download yourself that on the website of Fairware Foundation. And there's a study about China and India and Turkey. So you can read, for instance, that in China, there is no child labor, for example. But there are other problems like low salary or very high overtime. So other tools are trainings, are webinars. There are different tools. And it's also important to divide between high risk and low risk country. Of course, if Manroof sources in a low risk country, you don't need a high cost to do this due diligence. So if we order somewhere, we always look, it's a high risk country or it's a low risk country. Next slide. So how does it start? The monitoring work. The basis are the audits, and you can do your due diligence good if you have a good audits, a reliable audit with good information. And so if you don't have an audit, actually you cannot start this work. And every 3 years our suppliers are audited by Fairware Foundation, and when you get this audit, it's like the light gets on in a dark room, because before you have almost no information about this company, and with this audit you get a lot of information. You know the owner, you know the manager, also in Chinese letters. So it's really interesting to read a audit report, a Fairware audit report, and then for the next 3 years, the audit is the base for the continuing improvements. Of course, it is very important that the supplier agrees with the findings in the audit. So you need a kind of trust of cooperation to do these improvements. And an important role is also our external CSR consultant, which helps us to make the improvements. Next slide. So when I talk often to other people which don't know our market or our company, they are very surprised that we go so deep and do this work and check the fire extinguisher in these factories. And actually they ask, why do you do that? And you are in another country, you live, you speak another language, and that's just our responsibility. And if we don't do it, nobody will do it. It's not a responsibility of an NGO, of the government, because we have the money, so we can make some pressure to make these improvements. So after receiving the audit report, you share it with your external consultant and with the supplier. And you also receive an Excel file called Corrective Action Plan. You see on the right side. And it's like a homework tool with maybe 30 open points. And there are, might be very, very easy open points or very difficult open points. And these open points you can divide in 3 groups. There is a health and insurance, overtime and living wage. And of course, health insurance is the easiest part, and the other 2 are more difficult to solve. So we can go to the next slide. So when you get to the audit report, you need to have some strategy if you start working new with the supplier, and then you, of course, you try to improve the easy ones, the easy open points, like the fire extinguisher or evacuation plan or other easy things. And maybe the discussions about salary and overtime you might do later when you have a good trust and also good leverage. And you see on the right side a Word file which is sent to the supplier with the open points. So the supplier can then fill out the right side, and he needs to send me proof that he improved, that the problem is solved. And of course, you need trainings. The factory need trainings because there is also a lack of formality, that the human resource might not be so professional because it's a small company with only 50 workers. So you need always to visit trainings, workshops, and the standard, in this case, FAIR Foundation, give us this help to do all that. Okay, so we go to the next slide. So yeah, on the right side, on the bottom, you see our external consultants. They are key persons to make the improvements, and they have much more inside information in the country about the local law. So we pay them by hour, and they are always in contact with the suppliers. And what we have achieved now is we have mainly improved the safety and insurance because it's the easiest part. And we have, with our biggest supplier, made an agreement about living wages. So we pay a gap. We pay 10,000 Swiss francs a year to pay the gap, so the workers get additional money, and our external consultant controls the payment with pay slips. In fact, the supplier needs to have open books, so you need really to have a good trust and also a leverage. You need also to have good orders, otherwise you will not, the supplier might not cooperate. And of course, there is still some light and shadow. We can't solve all problems. Like in China, it's very difficult to solve the problem with overtime. But you can see the problems on our website in the social report. So as member of Fairway, we need to show transparency, and there is light and shadow. And we can go to the next slide. So here you can see we try to show how this is an ongoing process. On the right side, there will be company Manroof, that you have an external consultant, you do the audit, then you do the improvements, and this works never stop. And on the left side, you see a more common company where they only have a dialogue for price and quality. They might do some due diligence with certification. They look, do they have an audit or a certification, and then their CSR work already stops. So we go far beyond with this standard fair foundation. And of course, you can do only this work if you have a leverage. So you need to pay in dollars or euros. So you have to have good orders to bargain the good working conditions. And of course, you can ask why Manroof does all that work. So at one hand, we think we just want a kind of clean production, but we also can do business with that philosophy, that we can find clients which are interested in this work, and they might want to give giveaways which are produced in good working conditions. So the more clients we have like this, the more we can invest in this work. And in our case, the costs are about 30,000 francs a year. So this living wage project is about 10,000 francs a year at the moment. And then you have 3 standards, and each standard you have to be member certified. So each standard is about 4,000 Swiss francs. And then you have also costs for the external consultants and audits. We do 1 or 2 audits only a year. And so you spend 30,000 francs. This is 1% of our turnover. So that's workable for us. And in addition, I can say that we sell our products for market prices. So we still try to have market prices and not to be more expensive than our competitors. And maybe one more information is that this Manroof CSR engagement is a verifying philosophy, like is a philosophy from Fair Foundation, which is verifying and not certifying. That's a very important difference, because when you have a standard which is only based on certifying on audits only, then you might not have this monitoring work. And so we go far beyond, and we really offer to our clients a very deep monitoring about the working conditions. Yeah, next slide. Here again, you see the link between our engagement living wage that we cover different SDGs. So the important thing for us is that we use the standards to do the due diligence, and it's important to have reliable standards. And of course, it's in our interest to make the reliable standards more popular, that people find our company through these reliable standards. Okay.
Excellent, thank you, Jacques. And indeed, it's a good way. Thank you for ending on these notes of, among others, verifying versus certifying, because indeed, I guess that, as I mentioned before, it's about continuous improvement. It's an ongoing process, and it's not about just putting a stamp and then thinking, okay, now I'm done, but it's about continuously improving things, and I would even say, yeah, it is indeed about verifying, but I guess it is also about engaging in a different relationship with your suppliers, to also empower your suppliers to be able to work according to standards that are aligned also with your own company's expectations. All right, so it's 1:45, so we are, I think, quite respectful of our agenda. Well done. Really, wow, that's really Swiss timing. So we wanted to give now enough time to
how Jacque and Sarah also positioned the human rights, and especially Jacque then also tied it back into what that actually means for an SME in Switzerland. And Manroof is also a participant in the Swiss Triple Impact Program, and we really do try to incorporate the human rights, and thankfully, or yeah, luckily, the human rights are actually indirectly, implicitly already feeding into the SDGs in so many different ways. And so I would say the most relevant and like straightforward way that the Swiss Triple Impact is addressing the human rights and due diligence aspect is by applying and using the SDG Action Manager. I won't go into the tool and give you an introduction. That for that you'll need to take part into an introduction workshop of the Swiss Triple Impact Program. But essentially, you have different questionnaires to every SDG, and within each of these mini questions you have, it ties back into the human rights. For example, as Sarah also mentioned, that a key point wherein a SME ties in the human rights is through a code of conduct. So that's one of the questions that the SDG Action Manager tries to figure out: how much does this company already bring that into their key message and yeah, their core of their business model. And in every SDG, you have questions that relate then to human rights for specific, like if, for example, with quality education, therein you also have questions back to the human rights, which, yeah, I think they feed off each other. They're very interrelated, and that's how the Swiss Triple Impact supports it and also drives the progress therein. So I think on a closing note, I invite you all to participate in an introduction workshop to the Swiss Triple Impact to get to know it better and to see how we really try and foster this activation of companies and their participation. You can, of course, also sign into the SDG Action Manager. I'll send you the presentation, so you'll have the link here. It's a tool that's free to use for everybody, and I think especially for all of you working in the field, it's a good tool to know and to, yeah, also have in your back mind if you actually want to work with the SDGs in particular with any of your clients or your network. And if you do decide to then become part of the Swiss Triple Impact, we have our first prioritization workshops then starting after the Christmas break in January, which you're all very welcome to join. And another thing now with Corona and everybody being yeah, in home office like we all are, we launched a LinkedIn group where we invite all of our participants and our network to be part of, where people share the most relevant information, their progress that could also be of interest to other groups or other companies, and thereby really trying to foster this network within the Swiss Triple Impact, but also in the Swiss economy as a broader concept. So I thank you all for taking part today in our workshop, and especially a big thank you to Sarah and Jacque for taking the time to give us this introduction. And as I mentioned, I'll send you all the slides, and if you have any other questions, you can contact me, Sarah, or Jacque, and